Hello Year 11s and welcome to the second video in our series of 2 videos in which we look at civil remedies. There are 2 types of civil remedies that we are discussing. The first type of civil remedy is damages, and that is what the first video was about. The second type of civil remedies is injunctions, and that is what this video is about. There are 4 things that you need to do while you're watching this video. The first thing is to take the very best Cornell notes that you can. The second thing is to use the pause and rewind functions. Use the pause function if you need to stop this video to take notes. Use the rewind function if you need to go back over any information contained in this video. The third thing that you need to do is have your vocabulary sheet open in front of you so that you can write into your vocabulary sheet the definitions of key terms or of any other words that you may be unfamiliar with. And the fourth thing that you need to do is have your summary books open in front of you. In this video, I will give you some guidance as to what you should write in your summary books. Once you've finished watching this video, please read the relevant pages from the textbook referred to on this slide. And if you find any additional information from that reading that you think is useful, then supplement your Cornell notes with that information. Well, let's get started then. There are 2 learning intentions for this video. Make sure that you write these down in your Cornell notes. The first learning intention is that you need to be able to describe injunctions and their purposes. The second learning intention is that you need to be able to discuss the ability of injunctions to achieve their purposes. The information contained in this video will help you to achieve these learning intentions, and we'll be doing some activities in class which will also help you to achieve these learning intentions. Just by way of recap, damages and injunctions are both types of civil remedies. Civil remedies are sometimes just referred to as remedies. A remedy is an order that is made by a court to resolve a civil dispute. The remedy that a plaintiff asks a court to award when the plaintiff sues a defendant is set out in the plaintiff's statement of claim. A statement of claim is a document that the plaintiff serves on the defendant when the plaintiff is suing the defendant for a civil wrong. This document sets out the details of the plaintiff's claim against the defendant. You should also remember that the overarching purpose of civil remedies is to restore, as far as possible, the plaintiff, that is, the party whose rights have been infringed, to their original position, that is, the position the plaintiff was in before the wrong occurred, that is, before the plaintiff's rights were infringed. As I will explain later, it will often be a combination of damages and injunctions rather than just damages or just an injunction that will best achieve this purpose of civil remedies for a plaintiff. The focus of this video is on injunctions. As you can see, there are 2 different types of injunctions. Each of these types of injunctions has a particular purpose, and these particular purposes align with the overarching purpose of civil remedies, which is to restore the plaintiff as far as possible to their original position. On this slide, I've set out a table that you must include in your summary books. On the left-hand side of this table, I have listed the different types of injunctions. As we go through this video, you will need to complete the 2 right-hand columns of this table by summarizing the particular purposes of each of these different types of injunctions and the extent to which each of these different types of injunctions achieve the overarching purpose of civil remedies. An injunction is a court order that requires a defendant to stop doing something or that requires the defendant to do something. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term injunction and write this definition in there. As you've probably picked up from the definition of injunction, there are 2 main types of injunctions. The first type of injunction is called a restrictive injunction, also known as a prohibitory injunction. A restrictive or prohibitory injunction is an injunction that requires a defendant to stop doing something, that is, to stop causing loss. The purpose of a restrictive or prohibitory injunction is therefore to require a defendant to stop causing loss to the plaintiff. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term restrictive or prohibitory injunction and write this definition in there. Then write the purpose of a restrictive injunction in the middle column of your summary book table. An example of where a restrictive injunction would be appropriate is where a developer proposes to demolish a heritage building and the local council believes that the developer doesn't have the right to demolish that building. In such a case, the council might be able to persuade a court to grant a restrictive injunction, that is, an injunction that stops the developer from demolishing the heritage building. Now, remember that the overarching purpose of civil remedies is to return the plaintiff as far as possible to their original position. Unlike damages, restrictive injunctions do not achieve this purpose through the payment of money, but through ordering the defendant to stop doing something. A restrictive injunction orders the defendant to stop doing something that is causing loss to the plaintiff. In this way, a restrictive injunction tries to restore the plaintiff to their original position by preventing the defendant from causing further loss to the plaintiff. A restrictive injunction will achieve this purpose perfectly where the defendant is stopped before they can cause any loss to the plaintiff. However, a restrictive injunction cannot undo loss that the defendant has already caused to the plaintiff. It can only stop future loss being caused to the plaintiff. So, where the defendant has already caused loss to the plaintiff, a restrictive injunction cannot perfectly restore the plaintiff to their original position. Summarize what I've just said about the extent to which restrictive injunctions achieve the overarching purpose of civil remedies in the right-hand column of your summary book table. The reference to extent means that you have to explain how restrictive injunctions do achieve this overarching purpose of civil remedies, as well as the limitations on the ability of restrictive injunctions to achieve this overarching purpose. The other type of injunction is a mandatory injunction. A mandatory injunction is an injunction that requires a defendant to do something, that is, to rectify or fix up some loss. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term mandatory injunction and write this definition in there. The purpose of a mandatory injunction is therefore to require a defendant to rectify a loss that the defendant has caused to the plaintiff. Write this purpose in the middle column of your summary book table. An example of where a mandatory injunction would be appropriate is where a factory is polluting a river by pouring chemicals into it, and these chemicals flow downstream and contaminate the water that is drunk by a farmer's cows. In such a case, the farmer might be able to persuade a court to grant a mandatory injunction, that is, an injunction that requires the factory to clean up the pollution in the river. Again, remember that the overarching purpose of civil remedies is to return the plaintiff as far as possible to their original position. Unlike damages, mandatory injunctions do not achieve this purpose through the payment of money, but through ordering the defendant to do something. A mandatory injunction orders the defendant to do something to rectify the loss that the defendant has caused the plaintiff. In this way, a mandatory injunction tries to restore the plaintiff to their original position by requiring the defendant to undo the loss that the defendant has caused to the plaintiff. A mandatory injunction will achieve this purpose perfectly where the defendant can do something that totally undoes the loss the defendant has caused. However, a mandatory injunction cannot undo loss that has not yet occurred. For example, it cannot stop a developer from demolishing a heritage building. In addition, in some cases, there might be nothing that a defendant can be ordered to do that will rectify the loss that the defendant has caused to the plaintiff. For example, a defendant who has injured a plaintiff by negligently causing a car accident cannot realistically be ordered to give the plaintiff medical treatment to fix the plaintiff's injuries. So, where the defendant has not yet caused loss to the plaintiff or cannot rectify any loss that the defendant has caused to the plaintiff, a mandatory injunction cannot perfectly restore the plaintiff to their original position. Summarize what I've just said about the extent to which mandatory injunctions achieve the overarching purpose of civil remedies in the right-hand column of your summary book table. The reference to extent means that you have to explain how mandatory injunctions do achieve this overarching purpose of civil remedies, as well as the limitations on the ability of mandatory injunctions to achieve this overarching purpose. So far, we have looked at the purposes of injunctions. Our second learning intention requires you to be able to discuss the ability of injunctions to achieve their purposes. On this slide, I've set out a table which describes the strengths and weaknesses of injunctions in achieving their purposes. You could use this table to assist you to answer a question which requires you to discuss the extent to which injunctions achieve their purposes. Because this is a discussion, when you're contrasting strengths against weaknesses, you will be using words such as however, on the other hand, in contrast, while, and whereas. Now, I have numbered the items in this table in the order that I would refer to them if I was to answer such a question. Please include this table in your summary books together with any other notes on the table that you need to understand it. Starting off with restrictive injunctions can stop a defendant from causing loss to a plaintiff. On the other hand, a restrictive injunction is of no use where a defendant has already caused loss to the plaintiff. This is because the loss has already occurred, and so there is nothing that can be done to prevent that loss. Going back to the example of the developer and the heritage building, if the builder has already demolished the heritage building, then a restrictive injunction will be of no use because there is no loss that can be stopped. The loss, that is, the destruction of the heritage building, has already occurred. In contrast, a mandatory injunction can require a defendant to rectify, that is, fix up, a loss that the defendant has caused to a plaintiff. However, a mandatory injunction is of no use where the loss has not yet occurred, or the loss has occurred but the defendant cannot rectify the loss. Going back to the example of the factory polluting the river, if the factory has not yet poured chemicals into the river but is only proposing to do that in the future, then there is no loss that can be rectified or fixed up. The loss, that is the contamination of the cow's drinking water, has not yet occurred. And going back to the example of the defendant negligently injuring the plaintiff in a car accident, the defendant cannot rectify or fix up the loss, that is, the plaintiff's injuries. Only a doctor can do that. In addition, there may be some cases in which the payment of money, that is, the payment of damages to the plaintiff, would be better for the plaintiff than an injunction. Again, going back to the example of the factory polluting the river, if the contamination of the river has actually killed the farmer's cows, then a mandatory injunction that requires the factory to clean up the pollution will not compensate the farmer for the dead cows. Instead, the farmer will want to be paid money, that is, damages equivalent to the value of the cows that have died. The final point relates to restrictive injunctions. A restrictive injunction will not be effective at stopping a defendant from causing loss to a plaintiff in the future if what the defendant does is outside the scope of the injunction. For example, let's suppose that, in the case of the factory polluting the river, the farmer is successful in obtaining an injunction that stops the factory from pouring arsenic into the river. That would prevent the factory from polluting the river with arsenic in the future. but it would not stop the factory from polluting the river with cyanide. So that's an example of where the defendant might still continue to cause loss to the plaintiff because what the defendant is doing is outside the scope of the injunction. Thinking back over both the first video and this video, you can see that damages and injunctions have both strengths and weaknesses in their ability to achieve the overarching purpose of civil remedies, that is, to restore a plaintiff as far as possible to their original position. This means that it will often be a combination of damages and injunctions, rather than just damages or just an injunction, that will best achieve this overarching purpose of civil remedies. And so it will often be the case that a plaintiff who is suing a defendant will request the court to award both damages and an injunction to the plaintiff. Let's revisit for the last time the case of the factory polluting the river and poisoning a farmer's cows. In that case, the best way of restoring the farmer as far as possible to the farmer's original position is a combination of damages and injunctions. The farmer will want to be paid damages to compensate the farmer for the value of the dead cows. The farmer will want a mandatory injunction that requires the factory to clean up the pollution that the factory has poured into the river. And the farmer will want a restrictive injunction that stops the factory from continuing to pour pollution into the river. This is a very good point to remember for a SAC or exam. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. As a result of watching and taking notes on this video, you should now be able to do two things. The first thing is to describe injunctions and their purposes. The second thing is to discuss the ability of injunctions to achieve their purposes. We'll be doing some learning activities in class which will consolidate your ability to achieve these learning intentions. Please remember to read the relevant pages from the textbook referred to on the first slide in this video. If you find any additional information that you think is useful, then supplement your Cornell notes with that additional information. Thank you for your attention.